Robert Martinez woke up that Tuesday morning with no idea his life was about to change forever. He pulled his dress blue uniform from the closet, the same one he'd worn to his retirement ceremony 3 years earlier. The fabric still smelled faintly of the dry cleaner's starch, and as he buttoned up the jacket, muscle memory kicked in from 20 years of military service. Today was supposed to be simple. Just a quick trip to the courthouse to handle a speeding ticket he'd gotten last month. Nothing major, just 47 in a 35 zone while rushing to pick up his daughter from soccer practice. He could have paid online, but something about facing things head-on felt right. Maybe it was the Marine in him, or maybe he just wanted to show respect for the system. As he adjusted his uniform in the mirror, his fingers automatically straightened the ribbons on his chest. The Purple Heart sat prominently among them, its distinctive purple and gold catching the morning light. He'd earned it the hard way during his final deployment in Afghanistan. An IED explosion had torn through his convoy, leaving him with a leg full of shrapnel and memories he still wrestled with in quiet moments. The drive to the courthouse took 20 minutes through familiar streets. Robert had lived in this town his whole life, except for his years in the service. He knew every corner, every traffic light. His auto repair shop was just 5 miles from the courthouse, a small business he'd built from nothing after leaving the military. It wasn't making him rich, but it paid the bills and kept him busy. Walking up the courthouse steps, Robert noticed other people glancing at his uniform. Some nodded respectfully, others just stared. He was used to it by now. Veterans stood out, especially in full dress uniform. A few people even said thank you for his service as he passed through the metal detectors. The security guard, an older man with kind eyes, smiled as Robert placed his items in the bin. "Navy?" the guard asked, noting the uniform. "Marines," Robert replied with a slight grin. 20 years. "Thank you for your service, son. Courtroom 3 is down the hall to your right." The hallway buzzed with typical courthouse activity. Lawyers in expensive suits hurried past with briefcases. Families sat on benches, some looking worried, others just waiting. Robert found courtroom 3 and took a seat in the back row. The wooden benches reminded him of church pews from his childhood. Judge Patricia Hendricks entered at exactly 9 o'clock. She was a stern-looking woman in her 50s, with graying hair pulled back severely, and glasses that seemed to magnify her sharp gaze. The bailiff called the court to order, and everyone stood. Robert stood at attention out of habit, his posture straight and military precise. The first few cases moved quickly. Traffic violations, minor disputes, nothing too dramatic. Robert watched the process with interest. He'd never been in trouble before, never needed to appear in court for anything. The whole system fascinated him in a way, seeing how justice played out in these everyday moments. When his name was called, Robert stood and walked to the front of the courtroom. His military bearing was unmistakable as he approached the bench, shoulders back, head high. He'd been taught to show respect to authority, and a judge certainly qualified as authority in his book. "Robert Martinez, Your Honor," he said clearly. When asked to state his name, that's when Judge Hendricks noticed his uniform, specifically the decorations on his chest. Her eyes narrowed as they focused on the Purple Heart. For a moment, the courtroom was quiet except for the hum of the air conditioning and the soft rustle of papers. "Sir," the judge said, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "Remove that medal immediately." Robert blinked, certain he'd misheard. "Excuse me, Your Honor. That medal on your chest, remove it now. My courtroom has a strict policy against displays that could influence proceedings or show bias." The words hit Robert like a physical blow. Around the courtroom, people began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. A few veterans in the gallery exchanged glances of disbelief. The Purple Heart wasn't just a piece of metal to Robert or to any veteran. It represented blood spilled, sacrifice made, a price paid that could never be fully repaid. "Your Honor," Robert said carefully, his voice respectful but strained. "This is the Purple Heart. I earned it when I was wounded in Afghanistan. It's part of my dress uniform." Judge Hendricks's expression hardened further. "I don't care what it represents or where you earned it. In my courtroom, we don't allow displays that might create sympathy or bias. You will remove it now or you'll face contempt of court charges. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Robert felt every eye on him, felt the weight of the moment pressing down like a physical force. His hands trembled slightly as he reached up to his chest. The Purple Heart had been pinned there with such pride just hours earlier. Now, under the harsh fluorescent lights and the judge's demanding glare, it felt like he was being stripped of more than just a medal. His fingers fumbled with the clasp. 20 years of service, 3 deployments, countless nights away from his family, and it all came down to this moment in a small-town courtroom. The metal felt cold against his fingertips as he unpinned it from his uniform. The fabric where it had been attached looked somehow naked now, incomplete. "Place it in your pocket," the judge instructed, her tone suggesting she was doing him a favor by not making him hand it over entirely. Robert slipped the Purple Heart into his jacket pocket, his jaw clenched tight. Around the courtroom, he could hear people whispering, could feel their shock and anger building like pressure in a sealed container. A woman in the third row shook her head in disgust. An older man who looked like he might be a veteran himself had his hands balled into fists. The actual hearing took less than 5 minutes after that. Robert paid his fine, accepted his traffic school assignment, and answered the judge's questions with military precision. But something had fundamentally changed in that courtroom. What should have been a routine appearance had become something else entirely, something that would ripple outward in ways no one could have predicted. As Robert walked toward the exit, still feeling exposed without his medal properly displayed, he had no idea that someone in the courtroom had captured the entire exchange on their phone. He didn't know that within hours, his humiliation would become a rallying cry for veterans across the country. He just knew that something precious had been taken from him in that courtroom, something that went far beyond a piece of metal and ribbon. The Purple Heart felt heavy in his pocket as he walked back to his truck, heavier than it had ever felt pinned to his chest where it belonged. 22-year-old Jessica Chen sat in the back corner of courtroom 3, trying to stay invisible while working on her college journalism assignment. She was supposed to observe court proceedings for her media law class, writing about how justice worked at the local level. It seemed like boring homework until she witnessed something that made her blood boil. She'd been recording short clips on her phone throughout the morning, just random moments to help her remember details for her paper later. Most judges didn't mind as long as you were quiet about it. When the veteran in the dress uniform approached the bench, Jessica almost put her phone away. Just another traffic case, nothing worth noting. But then the judge opened her mouth. Jessica's finger hovered over the stop button as Judge Hendricks demanded the veteran remove his medal. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Her own grandfather had served in Vietnam, came home with stories he rarely shared and scars he never talked about. She knew what that Purple Heart meant, even if the judge apparently didn't. As Robert Martinez reluctantly unpinned his medal, Jessica kept recording. Her hands shook with anger, but she held the phone steady. Every second of this needed to be captured. The pain on the veteran's face, the shocked whispers from other people in the courtroom, the judge's cold indifference to what she was demanding. When court recessed for lunch, Jessica practically ran to her car. She sat there for 10 minutes watching the recording over and over. Each time made her angrier. This wasn't just wrong, it was cruel. Someone needed to see this. Someone needed to know what had happened to this man who'd served his country. Back in her dorm room that evening, Jessica stared at her laptop screen. She'd already written her assignment about the court proceedings, but she couldn't stop thinking about the veteran, the way his hands trembled as he removed that medal. The humiliation in his eyes, the judge's complete lack of respect for what that Purple Heart represented. Her roommate Katie walked in while Jessica was still debating what to do with the video. "You've been staring at that screen for an hour," Katie said, flopping onto her bed. "What's wrong?" Jessica showed her the recording. Katie's jaw dropped as she watched the exchange. "Are you kidding me?" Katie said when it finished. "She made him take off his Purple Heart. That's insane. You have to post this." "I don't know," Jessica said. "I mean, I was just there for class. Should I really get involved?" "Are you serious? Right now?" Jess, this is journalism. This is exactly what you're supposed to do. Tell the story that needs to be told. Jessica knew Katie was right, but she still hesitated. Once she posted this online, there was no taking it back. The veteran, Robert Martinez, according to the court records, probably just wanted to pay his ticket and move on with his life. Did he want to be the center of attention? But then she thought about her grandfather again. About all the veterans who came home from wars and tried to live quiet lives, only to have their service dismissed or forgotten. Maybe this Robert Martinez needed someone to stand up for him, even if he hadn't asked for it. She uploaded the video to her social media accounts with a simple caption: "Judge forces Purple Heart recipient to remove medal in court." This is what happened today in our local courthouse. This veteran served our country and was wounded in action. He deserved better than this. At first, nothing happened. A few likes from friends, a couple of shares. Jessica went to bed thinking maybe the video would just fade away like most social media posts do. She was wrong. Her phone started buzzing at 6 in the morning. Notifications were flooding in faster than she could read them. The video had been shared hundreds of times overnight. Veterans groups were reposting it. Military family pages were spreading it across their networks. Comments were pouring in, and most of them were furious. "This is disgusting," one comment read. "That man bled for this country and some judge treats him like garbage." "I served 3 tours and this makes me sick," wrote another veteran. "No one should treat our Purple Heart recipients this way." By noon, the video had reached 50,000 views. Local news stations started calling Jessica's phone. She ignored the first few calls, overwhelmed by what was happening. But when Channel 7 News called, she finally answered. "Is this Jessica Chen who posted the courthouse video?" the reporter asked. "Yes, that's me," Jessica said, her voice shaky. "We'd like to interview you about what you witnessed. This story is gaining national attention. Can you come to our station this afternoon?" National attention? Jessica's head spun. All she'd done was post a video of something that felt wrong. She never expected it to explode like this. The news interview was surreal. Jessica sat across from veteran reporter Tom Bradley, trying to explain what she'd witnessed without sounding like an activist or troublemaker. She just told the truth about what happened, how it felt to watch a decorated veteran be humiliated for displaying his Purple Heart. "Why did you decide to record and share this?" Bradley asked. "My grandfather served in Vietnam," Jessica said. "He taught me to respect veterans, to understand what they sacrificed for us. When I saw what happened to Mr. Martinez, I knew it was wrong. I couldn't just stay quiet about it." The interview aired that evening, and the video exploded even further. By the end of the week, it had 3 million views across different platforms. Major news networks picked up the story. Veterans organizations were organizing protests. Military blogs were writing detailed articles about the incident. Jessica's phone never stopped ringing. Interview requests, messages from veterans sharing their own stories, calls from legal experts wanting to discuss the case. She'd gone from unknown college student to the person who exposed what many people saw as a clear case of disrespect toward military veterans. But in all the chaos, Jessica kept thinking about Robert Martinez. While everyone was talking about the judge and the controversy, she wondered how he was handling suddenly being at the center of a national debate. She'd seen his auto repair shop mentioned in some news articles. Reporters were probably camping. Outside his business, customers were probably asking him about the incident. 3 days after posting the video, Jessica drove to Martinez Auto Repair. She found Robert working under the hood of an old pickup truck, trying to ignore the small crowd of reporters and well-wishers hanging around outside his shop. "Mr. Martinez?" she called out nervously. He looked up, oil smudged on his hands, and recognized her immediately from the news coverage. "You're the young lady who posted the video," he said. His voice wasn't angry, just tired. "I'm sorry," Jessica said quickly. "I know this probably isn't what you wanted. All this attention, I mean." Robert wiped his hands on a rag and really looked at her for the first time. She was just a kid, probably not much older than his own daughter. Her eyes showed genuine concern, not the hungry look of someone chasing fame. "What's your name?" he asked. "Jessica. Jessica Chen." "Well, Jessica Chen, Robert said with a small smile. "I want to thank you." "Thank me?" "That judge was wrong," he said. "What she did was wrong. And if you hadn't spoken up, nobody would have known about it. Sometimes people need to see the truth, even when it's uncomfortable." As Jessica drove away from the shop, she realized something important. Journalism wasn't just about getting good grades or building a career. Sometimes it was about standing up for people who couldn't stand up for themselves. Sometimes it was about making sure the truth didn't stay hidden in small courtrooms where nobody was watching. The video continued to spread, and Jessica continued to field calls from reporters and producers. But now she knew she'd done the right thing. Some stories were too important to keep quiet about, and some people deserved to have their voices heard. The phone rang at 7 in the morning in Judge Patricia Hendricks' home office. She'd been expecting it, dreading it, but knowing it would come eventually. The caller ID showed the number for the California Commission on Judicial Performance, and her stomach dropped as she answered. "Judge Hendricks, this is Director Williams from the Commission. I'm sure you're aware of the video that's been circulating regarding an incident in your courtroom last week." Patricia gripped the phone tighter. She'd watched the video dozens of times since her assistant had shown it to her 3 days ago. Each viewing made her feel sicker, not because she thought she was wrong, but because of how bad it looked. Context was everything, and the video had none. "I'm aware of it," she said carefully. "We're opening a formal investigation into your conduct. You'll be receiving official paperwork today, but I wanted to give you advance notice. I'd recommend contacting your attorney." After the call ended, Patricia sat in her office staring out the window. 25 years of legal experience, 15 years as a judge, and it might all come crashing down because of one stubborn veteran who couldn't follow simple courtroom rules. She'd implemented her no displays policy years ago after a defendant showed up wearing gang colors, clearly trying to intimidate witnesses. Then there was the woman who wore a shirt with her dead son's picture, sobbing dramatically every time the opposing attorney spoke. Patricia believed in order, in fairness, in making sure emotions didn't cloud justice. But as she watched the video, again she began to see how others might view it differently. The veteran looked genuinely confused, hurt even. His military bearing was obvious even through the phone screen. And that medal, she'd learned from angry commenters, was awarded only to those wounded in combat. Maybe she should have explained her policy better. Maybe she should have made an exception. But judges couldn't show weakness, couldn't second-guess every decision based on public opinion. Could they? Meanwhile, across town at the courthouse, bailiff Danny Rodriguez was having the worst week of his career. He'd worked Judge Hendricks' courtroom for 3 years, and reporters kept cornering him in hallways, asking about her behavior toward veterans and other groups. Danny was a veteran himself, Army National Guard with 2 deployments to Iraq. He'd watched the interaction between the judge and Robert Martinez with growing discomfort, but he'd stayed silent. That was his job, to maintain order, not to question the judge's decisions. Now he was questioning everything. "Danny, you got a minute?" Court Administrator Lisa Park approached him during lunch break. "The commission investigators want to speak with you this afternoon." Danny's sandwich suddenly tasted like cardboard. He'd known this was coming, but it still felt like a punch to the gut. What was he supposed to say? That he'd watched Judge Hendricks humiliate a fellow veteran and done nothing to stop it? The interview took place in a sterile conference room on the 3rd floor. 2 investigators, a man and woman in expensive suits, sat across from Danny with recording equipment and thick folders. "Mr. Rodriguez, how long have you worked with Judge Hendricks?" the female investigator asked. 3 years this December," Danny replied, his hands sweating despite the air conditioning. "During that time, have you observed any patterns in how she treats veterans appearing in her court?" Danny hesitated. Loyalty to his job fought against loyalty to his brothers and sisters in uniform, but the truth was the truth, and he'd sworn an oath to uphold it long before he'd ever worked in this courthouse. "She's made comments," he admitted quietly, "about veterans using their service to get sympathy. She said it's not fair to other defendants." "What kind of comments specifically?" Danny took a deep breath. "After cases involving veterans, she sometimes says things like, 'Everyone wants special treatment,' or This isn't the VA. Once she told me that military service doesn't make someone above the law. Did she ever instruct you to treat veteran defendants differently? Not exactly instruct, but she made it clear she didn't want any special consideration shown. No standing when they entered, no acknowledgement of their service, nothing that might influence the proceedings. The investigators took detailed notes, asking follow-up questions that made Danny's stomach churn. He wasn't trying to destroy Judge Hendricks' career, but he couldn't lie about what he'd witnessed. 2 floors down, court stenographer Beverly Walsh was having her own uncomfortable conversation with investigators. Beverly had been transcribing court proceedings for 12 years, and she'd developed an eye for patterns in judicial behavior. Judge Hendricks treated certain groups differently, Beverly explained, referring to her extensive notes. Veterans, obviously, but also elderly defendants, people with disabilities, anyone she perceived as seeking sympathy. She pulled out a transcript from 6 months earlier. This was a case involving an elderly man with Parkinson's disease. He was shaking during testimony, and she told him to control himself and threatened to have him removed if he couldn't sit still like everyone else. The investigators exchanged glances. This was bigger than one incident with a veteran. Do you have other examples? They asked. Beverly opened another file. A woman in a wheelchair last year. Judge Hendricks asked why she needed to bring her equipment into the courtroom and suggested she could have someone represent her instead. The woman was perfectly capable of speaking for herself. As the day wore on, more court employees came forward. Security guard Ted Johnson, who'd worked the courthouse for 8 years, described how Judge Hendricks often made disparaging comments about people's appearances, accents, or circumstances while walking to her chambers. She'd see someone in military dress and roll her eyes, Ted explained. Said they were playing dress up to avoid consequences, but it wasn't just veterans. She had problems with anyone who looked different or had obvious challenges. The pattern emerging from the investigation painted a picture of systematic bias rather than one bad decision. Judge Hendricks had spent years creating an environment where certain groups of people were treated as second-class citizens in her courtroom. Local attorney Michael Chen, no relation to Jessica, had practiced in Judge Hendricks' court for 5 years. When investigators reached out to him, he initially hesitated to speak on the record. Criticizing a sitting judge could hurt his practice, but the veteran's humiliation had bothered him for days. He'd seen too many clients treated unfairly in that courtroom. I've had clients asked to postpone hearings to avoid appearing before her, Michael admitted during his interview. Word gets around the legal community. We knew she had biases, but we worked around them. Maybe we should have spoken up sooner. Why? Didn't you file complaints before? An investigator asked. Michael shifted uncomfortably. She's the only judge in family court. Filing a complaint could hurt my client's cases. It's a small legal community here. You don't make enemies lightly. The investigators understood. Fear of retaliation kept many people quiet about judicial misconduct. That's why cases like this often required public pressure to bring hidden problems to light. Back at her home that evening, Judge Hendricks poured herself a glass of wine and tried to make sense of how everything had gone so wrong. The commission had suspended her from hearing new cases pending the investigation. The local bar association was asking questions. Her phone hadn't stopped ringing with reporters wanting statements. She'd always prided herself on running an efficient, orderly courtroom. No drama, no special treatment, equal justice for all. But watching the news coverage, seeing the veteran's wounded expression in that viral video, she began to wonder if her version of equal treatment had actually been unfair treatment for people who deserved better. The investigation was just beginning, but already Patricia could see where it was heading. Years of small cruelties, dismissive comments, and systematic bias were coming back to haunt her. One viral video had opened a door she'd kept closed for too long, and now everyone could see what had been happening behind it. Tomorrow would bring more interviews, more questions, more evidence of a pattern she'd convinced herself was just good judicial management. But tonight, sitting alone in her house with only the wine for company, Judge Patricia Hendricks finally understood what she'd really been doing all these years. She just wasn't sure it was too late to make it right. 3 weeks after the investigation began, Judge Patricia Hendricks sat in her lawyer's office staring at a stack of documents that represented the end of everything she'd worked for. The California Commission on Judicial Performance had compiled a devastating report, and her attorney David Goldman wasn't sugarcoating the situation. Patricia, they have testimony from 17 court employees, 43 attorneys, and dozens of defendants who appeared in your court, David said, his voice gentle but firm. The pattern they've documented goes back 8 years. This isn't about one incident anymore. Patricia's hands trembled as she flipped through witness statements. Danny Rodriguez describing her comments about veterans seeking special treatment. Beverly Walsh providing transcripts of her harsh words to disabled defendants. Even attorneys she'd considered allies had come forward with stories of her biased behavior. I was maintaining order, she whispered, more to herself than to David. I was trying to be fair to everyone. I know you believe that, David replied. But perception is reality in cases like this. The Commission sees systematic discrimination, not judicial efficiency. Down the hall from David's office, appeals. Attorney Rachel Torres was working late on what had become the case of her career. Ever since the veteran's video went viral, her phone hadn't stopped ringing with calls from people who'd appeared before Judge Hendricks and felt they'd been treated unfairly. Rachel had pulled 12 of Judge Hendricks' cases for appeal, each one showing clear evidence of bias. There was the immigrant father who'd been told to speak English or get a translator when he was perfectly fluent but nervous. The single mother who'd been lectured about making excuses when she explained her work schedule conflicts. The elderly veteran who'd been told to stop shaking during testimony about his war trauma. This is unbelievable, Rachel muttered to her paralegal as she reviewed another transcript. How did this go on for so long without anyone stopping it? Her paralegal, a recent law school graduate named Kevin, looked up from his research. Fear, probably. Who wants to challenge a sitting judge? It could hurt your career, damage your reputation. Easier to just work around the problem. Rachel knew Kevin was right, but it still bothered her. The legal system was supposed to protect everyone equally, especially vulnerable people who couldn't protect themselves. Judge Hendricks had violated that fundamental principle for years, and the legal community had stayed largely silent. Meanwhile, at the courthouse, Chief Judge Robert Kim was dealing with a crisis that seemed to grow worse every day. The media, attention hadn't died down. If anything, it was intensifying as more stories about Judge Hendricks' behavior came to light. We need to reassign all her pending cases, Judge Kim told Court Administrator Lisa Park during their daily crisis meeting. The public trust is completely broken. Even if she's eventually cleared, which seems unlikely, people won't accept her rulings. Lisa pulled up the case management system on her computer. She has 87 active cases. Family court, traffic violations, small claims. We'll need to distribute them among 4 other judges, and they're already overloaded. We don't have a choice, Judge Kim said. The integrity of the entire court system is at stake here. The reassignment process became a nightmare. Attorneys had to file new motions, defendants had to reschedule hearings, and the entire courthouse workflow ground nearly to a halt. What should have been a simple administrative task became a massive undertaking that affected hundreds of people. Back at her home, Judge Hendricks watched the evening news coverage of the courthouse chaos with growing horror. The reporter stood in front of the building she'd walked into every day for 15 years, describing the unprecedented disruption caused by her suspension. Sources inside the courthouse tell us that Judge Hendricks' removal from active cases has created a backlog that could take months to resolve, the reporter explained. Families waiting for custody decisions, small business owners seeking judgments, unpaid bills, and dozens of other cases are now in limbo. Patricia turned off the television and poured another glass of wine. She'd lost count of how many she'd had since coming home. But it didn't matter anymore. Nothing mattered anymore. Her career was over, her reputation destroyed, her life's work reduced to a cautionary tale about judicial misconduct. The worst part wasn't even the professional consequences. It was the growing realization that maybe, just maybe, all these people were right about her. Maybe she had been unfair. Maybe her pursuit of order and efficiency had crossed the line into cruelty. Her phone buzzed with a text from her sister, in Oregon. Saw the news again tonight. Are you okay? Do you want to come stay with us for a while? Patricia stared at the message for a long time before responding. "I'm fine. Just need some time to think." But she wasn't fine, and she knew it. The investigation had revealed parts of herself she didn't want to acknowledge. Reading through the testimony, seeing her own words quoted back to her, she could hardly recognize the person they described. When had she become so cold, so dismissive of other people's struggles? The next morning brought even worse news. Her attorney called with an update from the State Bar Association. "They're opening their own investigation," David explained. "The commission handles your role as a judge, but the Bar Association governs your license to practice law. Patricia, they could suspend your law license entirely." "What does that mean?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "It means, even if you resign from the bench, you might not be able to practice law anywhere in California. Maybe anywhere at all, depending on how other states react." Patricia sat down heavily in her kitchen chair. Being removed from the bench was one thing, but losing her law license entirely? That would make her unemployable in the only field she'd ever known. She'd have to start over completely at age 54, with a Google search that would forever link her name to discrimination and judicial misconduct. Over at Martinez Auto Repair, Robert Martinez was dealing with his own unexpected problems. The viral video had brought him more attention than he'd ever wanted, but it had also brought something else: customers. Lots of them. Veterans were driving from 3 counties away to have their cars serviced at his shop. People were leaving 5-star reviews online praising his service and character. His phone rang constantly with interview requests, speaking opportunities, and invitations to veterans' events. "I just wanted to pay a traffic ticket," Robert told his longtime customer and friend Pete Williams as they watched another news van pull up outside. "Now I can't go to the grocery store without someone wanting to shake my hand and thank me for my service." Pete, who'd served in the Navy during the same era as Robert, understood the mixed feelings. "You didn't ask for this, but maybe it's happening for a reason. That judge needed to be stopped, and your story was what finally did it." Robert nodded, but he still felt uncomfortable with all the attention. He wasn't a hero for being humiliated in court. He was just a guy who'd tried to show respect and been treated poorly for it. The real heroes were the people who'd spoken up afterward, who'd demanded better from their justice system. As evening approached and the news vans finally left, Robert stood in his shop looking at the Purple Heart he now kept in a small frame on his desk. The medal meant the same thing it had always meant to him: a reminder of friends lost, battles fought, and a younger version of himself who'd believed in serving something bigger than his own interests. But now it meant something else too. It had become a symbol of the fight for dignity and respect in places where those things should be guaranteed. Judge Hendricks had tried to take that away from him, but instead, she'd given it more power than it had ever had before. The irony wasn't lost on him. In trying to diminish what his Purple Heart represented, the judge had made it represent even more. 6 months after that fateful day in court, Robert Martinez stood at a podium in the state capitol building, looking out at a room filled with lawmakers, veterans, and advocates. He never imagined he'd be testifying before the California legislature, but here he was, sharing his story to help pass new legislation protecting veterans' rights in courtrooms. "When I walked into that courthouse wearing my uniform, I thought I was showing respect," Robert said into the microphone, his voice steady, despite his nerves. "I never expected to be humiliated for displaying a medal I earned with my blood. But maybe that humiliation happened for a reason. Maybe it was meant to expose a bigger problem." In the audience, Jessica Chen sat taking notes for the article. She was writing for her college newspaper. She'd graduated with honors and landed an internship at a major news outlet, largely because of her coverage of the courthouse incident. Watching Robert speak now, she felt proud of her decision to post that video 6 months ago. The legislation they were discussing would require sensitivity training for all court personnel regarding veterans' issues and military service. It would also establish clear guidelines protecting veterans' rights to wear military uniforms and decorations in court, with very limited exceptions for genuine safety concerns. "This isn't about special treatment," Robert continued. "It's about basic respect for people who served their country. A Purple Heart isn't jewelry or a fashion statement. It represents sacrifice, and that sacrifice should be honored, not hidden away in someone's pocket. Back in her small apartment across town, former Judge Patricia Hendricks watched the legislative hearing on her laptop. The California Commission on Judicial Performance had officially removed her from office 3 months earlier, citing willful misconduct and conduct prejudicial to the administration of justice. The State Bar Association had suspended her law license for 5 years, effectively ending her legal career. Patricia had lost her house, her savings depleted by legal fees and the inability to work. She was living in a modest apartment, working part-time at a nonprofit organization that helped people navigate the legal system. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was now helping the same types of people she'd once treated poorly from the bench. Watching Robert speak on her computer screen, Patricia felt the familiar stab of regret that had become her constant companion. She'd tried reaching out to him twice, wanting to apologize personally, but his lawyer had advised him not to have any contact with her. She understood why, but it still hurt. The nonprofit work was helping her understand something she'd missed during her years as a judge. The people who came through her courtroom weren't problems to be managed or cases to be processed quickly. They were human beings dealing with real struggles, real fears, and real consequences from the decisions she made. "I see now what I couldn't see then," she told her therapist during their weekly session. "I thought being tough and emotionless made me a good judge, but I was really just being cruel to people who needed understanding." Her therapist, Dr. Amanda Rodriguez, had been helping her work through the guilt and shame of her actions. "Understanding what went wrong is the first step toward making amends," Dr. Rodriguez had said. "But you have to accept that some damage can't be undone." Meanwhile, at the courthouse where it all began, Chief Judge Robert Kim was presiding over a very different kind of ceremony. The building was being renamed the Veterans Honor Courthouse, with a dedication ceremony attended by hundreds of veterans, their families, and community supporters. Robert Martinez had been invited to speak at the dedication, and he stood before the same building where he'd been humiliated 6 months earlier. But this time he wore his dress uniform with pride, his Purple Heart displayed prominently on his chest where it belonged. "This courthouse represents justice," Robert said to the gathered crowd. "But justice isn't just about following rules. It's about treating every person who walks through these doors with dignity and respect, regardless of who they are or what they've been through." The new plaque near the courthouse entrance read, "Veterans Honor Courthouse, dedicated to ensuring that those who served our nation receive the respect and dignity they earned through their sacrifice." Below that, in smaller text, "Let this serve as a reminder that justice without compassion is not justice at all." Local attorney Michael Chen, who had testified during the investigation, was also at the ceremony. He'd helped draft the new courthouse, policies that would prevent future incidents like the one that destroyed Judge Hendricks' career. All court personnel would now receive annual training on veterans' issues, disability rights, and cultural sensitivity. "We should have spoken up sooner," Michael told Robert after the ceremony. "The legal community knew she had problems, but we were all too worried about our own careers to do anything about it." Robert shook his hand. "What matters is that people are speaking up now. That's how we make sure this doesn't happen again." Jessica Chen, now working as a junior reporter for the local newspaper, was covering the courthouse dedication for her first major assignment. As she interviewed attendees, she kept thinking about how much had changed since that morning, when she'd just been a college student doing homework. "Do you ever regret posting that video?" she asked Robert during a brief interview. Robert thought for a moment before answering. "The attention was hard at first. I'm a private person, and suddenly everyone wanted to know my story. But if my embarrassment helped prevent other veterans from being treated that way, then it was worth it." The ceremony concluded with the unveiling of a memorial wall inside the courthouse lobby, featuring the names of local veterans who had died in service to their country. Robert's name wasn't on the wall. He'd come home alive, though scarred, but he stood quietly reading the names of those who hadn't been so fortunate. Later that evening, Robert returned to his auto repair shop. The media attention had mostly died down now, though he still got occasional customers who drove out of their way to support his business. The shop was doing better than ever, and he'd even hired 2 employees, both veterans who'd struggled to find work after their service. His daughter stopped by after her college classes, something she'd been doing more often since the courthouse incident. The experience had brought them closer together, helping her understand parts of her father's military service that he'd never talked about before. "Dad, I'm proud of you," she said as they locked up the shop together. "Not just for what happened in court, but for how you handled everything after. You could have been angry and bitter, but instead you used it to help other people." Robert hugged his daughter, thinking about how strange life could be. One moment of humiliation had somehow turned into an opportunity to make positive changes, to ensure other veterans wouldn't face the same disrespect he'd endured. Across town, Patricia Hendricks was finishing her shift at the nonprofit legal aid office. She'd helped 3 families that day navigate custody issues, housing disputes, and immigration questions. The work paid barely enough to cover her rent, but it was teaching her something she'd never learned in law school or during her years on the bench. She was learning what justice really meant when you were on the receiving end of it instead of dispensing it from behind an elevated desk. As she walked to her car, Patricia passed the Veterans Honor Courthouse on her way home. The new plaque gleamed under the streetlights and she stopped to read it again. The words stung, but they also reminded her of something important. Sometimes the worst mistakes could lead to the most necessary changes. She couldn't undo what she'd done to Robert Martinez or any of the other people she'd treated poorly over the years, but she could spend whatever time she had left trying to help people instead of hurting them. It wasn't redemption exactly, but it was a start. The Purple Heart incident had ended one career and transformed another. But more importantly, it had reminded an entire community that justice meant nothing without humanity. And sometimes that was the most valuable lesson of all.